Good line.
We will now continue with question and answer session. The first question is from Puebla, Mexico. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, and regards from the Technological Institute in Puebla. Our question is, what countries have been most greatly benefited by globalization, and how is it that students can be prepared to face this globalization? Thank you.
Which countries? Obviously the developed world, the Western Europe, North America, and some countries in Asia, but probably those most directly benefited beyond that are maybe what we used to refer to as the Asian tigers, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia. To a lesser extent, I think almost every country has at least pockets of benefit, and mostly in probably the cities. Of course, that then attracts population into the cities, so you get pockets of extreme poverty in those cities as well, which is one of the negative impacts.
And we stay in Mexico for our next question. Go ahead, please.
How are you? Good morning. I'm calling from the Universidad Tecnológica de Tecámac, State of Mexico. Question. Well, it is true that the percentage of the community which works in agriculture has gone down in the U.S. and Mexico. It is also true that the distribution of wealth is disproportionate. The people who work the land, those who have the technology to exploit it. There are people who have insufficient income to satisfy their most basic needs. So the question is, what kinds of strategies should governments and individuals implement to combat these secondary effects, such as hunger and lack of safety, given globalization?
In transition economies, and probably every economy in the world is in transition of one form or another, there are impacts on the people who are affected by the transitions. The transitions aren't going to stop. So if one of the intentions is how do we stop the transition, that's not going to happen. What can governments do to lessen the effects? Training programs and retraining programs, support systems for those who are in transition, who lose their jobs, are important. Particularly in agriculture, the questioner asked about things like safety issues. Yes, governments really do have a strong obligation, and ultimately it is governments that I think need to enforce safety regulation. It would be great if companies did it, and to some extent maybe competition forces companies to do that, but ultimately I think governments have to play a role in both developing the regulations and enforcing those regulations.
Yucatan, Mexico, go ahead please for the next question.
Good morning. We're calling from the CTM University, Yucatan. The question is as follows. In order to be competitive, one must know how to innovate, and current education isn't necessarily focused on this. What to do in order to change this mentality?
Wow, tough question. How do you change the mentality of focusing education on innovation? I don't think anybody has a solution to that particular issue. Education itself needs to be flexible, needs to train people in technology and in the details, but ultimately I think it's sort of the freedom that's in the economy, even the freedom that's in the educational system to allow people to try new things and not to try to move people specifically into particular areas that maybe in the past were the important areas to focus on.
Thank you. Our next question is faxed from Acapulco. The question is, since intellectual property and human competencies will be new route to wealth and fortune, will global regulations and recognition emerge for these two elements of human capital?
Well, there's strong pressure, at least from the developed world, to create worldwide standards for protection of intellectual property and for things like patents and copyrights, so that as people do innovate and develop new areas, these things can be protected, so that there is incentive that the person who develops new things can benefit from those developments. But my understanding is that some of this is getting so complex as intellectual property or new ideas impact each other that how these things are going to be protected is not clear yet, and I think this is going to take some time to work out.
Okay, and our next question is about English language proficiency. Will language proficiency become ever more an essential global skill despite the cultural baggage it brings, or do you think multilingualism will emerge? This is coming from San Diego Global University.
Again, maybe a complex response to this question. For many reasons, English has become the language of business and diplomacy and travel around the world. But increasingly also, I think it's important for people to speak multiple languages. You don't really learn another culture and its core values without understanding its language. So there's two sides to this. One is, yes, people are increasingly learning English, and it has become the language, as I deal with people from companies around the world, typically the language at which they operate at high levels of the company, no matter what country is involved, is in English. But having said that, if you're going to work with local people, you need to speak their language.
We have just a few seconds for one last question from Chihuahua. Go ahead, please.
Well, I'm calling from the Universidad Autónoma de Chihuahua. The question is how to establish or implement a network of outreach in order to achieve greater business success.
Well, business people and universities can support this, need to take steps to interact, to meet colleagues from other countries, and to interact with them in whatever ways they can.